Widowed Blacksmith waited 9 hours. A bride with no shoes stepped off crying. The letter came on a Tuesday in February, which I remember because I'd spent the morning pulling a dead calf from the mud at the Hennessy place, and my arms were still sore from it when I sat down at the table and read the thing twice. The agency in St. Louis said her name was Bridget Molly. Age 31. Irish-born. Experienced in domestic work, some cooking, some gardening, and willing to relocate permanently to the Western Territories. There was a photograph enclosed, which I won't pretend I didn't look at for longer than was necessary. A serious face, dark hair pulled back severe, eyes that didn't apologize for anything. I folded the letter and put it under the loose floorboard beside the wood stove, where I kept the deed to the land and the paper from the army about my son Cal. Then I went back out to the forge and didn't think about it for 3 days, or tried not to. The truth is I'd been trying not to think about things for about 4 years by then. My wife Nora died in the spring of 1881. Fever. It came on a Wednesday, and by Sunday she was gone, and there was nothing in the world I could have done about it, though I spent a long time after convincing myself otherwise. You do that. You go back over every hour looking for the place you could have changed something, and there isn't one. But you keep looking anyway because the looking keeps you busy, and busy is the only thing standing between you and the bottom of a bottle or a well. I had the shop. Cal was 15 then. I had those 2 things, and I worked the first one hard enough that I didn't have to think too much about what had gone out of the second. Cal left at 18 to go play soldier. He didn't come back. That's the paper under the floorboard. Killed in some skirmish out in the Arizona Territory, a place I've never been and have no desire to go. He was 21. I found out on a Friday, and I worked through the weekend because I didn't know what else to do. And when I finally stopped on Sunday night and sat down to eat something, I realized I hadn't spoken a word to another person in 3 days and hadn't noticed. That was when I started thinking about the advertisement in the back of the cattleman's paper. I'm not going to dress it up. What I was buying or trying to buy was company, someone to hear me come through the door at night, someone sitting on the other side of the table. I'd made my peace, or thought I had, with the idea that love was something that had happened to me once and wouldn't happen again, that what I'd had with Nora was a kind of luck that didn't repeat in a man's life, the same way you don't get struck by the same lightning twice. So I wasn't looking for love. I was looking for someone to share a house without making it worse. I sent the letter in March. The reply from the agency came in May. Bridget Molly had agreed to the arrangement. She would arrive in Dunmore on the 14th of July on the 3 o'clock train. I said all right. The 14th of July was the hottest day of that summer. I was at the station by 2. I don't usually fuss about being on time. A blacksmith's whole day runs on what needs doing next, not on the clock. But I was there by 2 because I didn't know what else to do with myself, and standing still in the shop felt worse than standing still at the platform. The train was late. I stood in the heat and waited. A few other people came and went. The station master, old Tug Ferris, came out once and asked if I needed water, and I told him no. I had my hat in my hands instead of on my head, which I didn't realize until I was already sweating through my collar, and then it seemed strange to put it back on. The 3 o'clock train arrived at 12 minutes past midnight. 9 hours and 12 minutes, for those who want the exact count. I know because Tug came out at some point and told me the telegraph wire had said there was an axle problem outside of Carthage, and that the repair would take until morning or longer. He asked again if I needed water. I told him again no. I sat down on the bench and I waited. I'm not sure what I thought during those 9 hours. Some of it was practical, whether I'd left the flue damped right, whether the Patterson mare's shoe would hold, or if she'd throw it again before I could get to it. Some of it was about Nora. That happened to me sometimes when I sat still too long. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. More like my mind going back to look for her out of habit. The way you reach for something on the shelf where it used to be, and your hand just goes there on its own before your brain catches up. Some of it was about the woman on the train. I won't pretend otherwise. Around 9 o'clock, a boy came through selling hard-boiled eggs, and I bought 2 and ate them without tasting them, and wiped my hands on my pants and went back to waiting. The train came in just after midnight. Steam and noise and the smell of hot iron and coal smoke, which I don't mind, it's close enough to my own smell that it feels familiar. People came down the steps. A family with 4 children, a cattle agent I recognized from somewhere, 2 men in suits. Then her. She was the last one off. She came down the steps careful, one hand on the rail, and I could see from where I stood that she had no shoes. Just stockings, and one of those had a hole in the heel. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder and a smaller bundle under her arm, and she stepped down onto the platform and stood there a moment the way a person does when they're deciding whether to cry or not. She cried. Not loud. She just put one hand over her face and her shoulders went up, and she stood there in the middle of the platform with no shoes on, crying quiet, and I stood there with my hat in my hands and didn't know what to do. I walked over. I said, "Miss Molly." She dropped her hand and looked at me, and I got my first real look at her face, which was like the photograph, but more so the serious set to it, but also something in the eyes that the photograph hadn't shown, some particular quality of having been scared for a long time and having decided not to let it beat her. Her face was dirty from the train and her hair had come half down, and she was a mess, frankly, but she looked at me with those eyes and lifted her chin. She said, "Mr. Kavanaugh, I'm sorry about the shoes. My bag was stolen in Memphis." I said, "Were you hurt?" She said, "No, just the bag." I said, "Was there anything in it you can't replace?" She thought about that, then she said, "Some letters." "From home." Her voice went tight on the last word, but she didn't look away from me. I said, "I'm sorry about that. And I meant it the way you mean something when you say it before you know you're going to. The rest we can replace." She nodded once like that was settled. I picked up her canvas bag. It was heavier than I expected. I asked her if she'd eaten anything, and she said she'd had some crackers on the train that a woman had shared with her. I said I had bread and cold beans at the house, and she said that sounded fine, and we walked out to where I'd left the wagon, and I helped her up, and we drove out of Dunmore at midnight with the stars very bright, and neither of us saying anything much. Which was all right. She seemed like a woman who didn't need to fill silence, and I've never been a man who did either. The house. I'd cleaned it, spent 2 full evenings on it the week before, which is 2 more evenings than I'd spent on it in the previous 4 years combined. Nora had kept it clean, and after she died I kept it functional, which is a different thing. Functional means nothing's rotting. Clean means someone takes pride in the place. I'd tried to bring it closer to the second. I'd failed in several respects. The curtains Nora had put up were stiff with years of grease smoke, and I couldn't figure out how to wash them without ruining them, and the southeast corner of the kitchen had a smell I couldn't locate no matter how many times I went looking for the source of it. When Bridget walked in, she stood for a moment in the middle of the kitchen and looked around the way a person looks at something they're deciding what to do about. She didn't say anything critical. She just set her bundle on the table and said, "Which room is mine?" I showed her the room off the back hall, which had been Cal's. I'd put clean sheets on the bed and left a lamp burning low. She looked at the room and then she looked at me and said, "Thank you, Mr. Kavanaugh, for waiting. You didn't have to wait that long." I said, "Where else would I have gone?" She looked at me a little differently after that. I didn't know what it meant. I went to bed and lay there listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person settling in across the hall, the creak of the bed ropes, the soft click of the lamp being turned out, and I stared at the ceiling and thought, well, here we are. We were married on a Saturday in August at the Methodist Church in Dunmore, which I want to say right away was simpler than it sounds. The Reverend was a man named Aldous Price who knew me from the times I'd shod his horse, and the ceremony was about 15 minutes, and the only witnesses were the Price's housekeeper and a man who happened to be standing outside the door when we came in. Bridget had a dress she'd borrowed from the seamstress in town. It was blue. She wore shoes which she'd bought at the dry goods store with money I'd given her, and I noticed she'd bought plain ones, nothing extravagant, which told me something about how she thought about money. We had not discussed love. We had discussed the terms of the arrangement, what was mine, what debts existed, what I expected of her in the running of the household, what I could offer in return. She'd listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her face serious and asked 2 questions, whether there was a stove that worked and whether she'd be expected to work in the shop. The first yes, the second no. She said that was fine. I walked out of the church with her hand on my arm and I thought, I have done something. I don't know if it's the right thing. But I have done something. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have guessed from the photograph, or the letter, or the 9 hours on the platform, or the 2 weeks we'd spent in the house before the wedding, being careful with each other the way strangers are careful, was that she was going to be good at it. Not good at keeping house, though she was. Not good at cooking, though she could cook a potato soup that made the kitchen smell like somewhere you wanted to be. Good at something else. She was good at seeing things. I don't mean in some mystical way. I mean she paid attention. She noticed what I ate and what I left. She noticed when I'd had a bad day at the forge without me having to say so. She noticed the way I sometimes stopped in the doorway of Cal's room, her room now, for just a half-second before I walked past. And she never asked about it, not once, but one morning I came in for dinner and found that she'd left the door open instead of closed, which was what she'd been keeping it, and there was a small bunch of wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. Just that. She didn't explain it, and I didn't ask. I noticed she wrote letters home, long ones in the evenings by lamplight. She wrote in a hand I could tell was careful and deliberate, the way a person writes when they didn't always have someone who thought it was worth teaching them. I asked her once early on if she heard back much from home. She said her mother wrote when she could, that her mother's hands were bad. I asked if she missed it, Ireland, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I miss the cold in the morning, the particular cold, it's different here." She paused. "But I don't miss being hungry." I said, "Were you hungry often?" She looked at me and said, "Often enough." After that, I started leaving the bread in a place she could find it without asking. The thing with the Patterson horse was in September. Old Harold Patterson, 4 sections south of town, ran cattle, generally made himself unpleasant to deal with, came in on a Thursday afternoon with his roan mare limping bad and a face like a storm. He stood in my shop and told me the shoe I'd put on her 2 months ago had caused the problem, which wasn't true. I'd put a good shoe on a horse that Harold had then ridden too hard on bad ground, which was the actual situation, and I said so, not rudely but clearly. He got loud. He got loud the way men get loud when they know they're wrong and can't admit it, making it bigger, adding things to it, telling me I was getting too old to do the work right, that his father had used a better smith in a different town 40 years ago, that he'd been hearing complaints about my work from others, which was a lie he'd invented on the spot. I could hear it in how he said it. He stood there in my shop and talked at me, and I stood and listened, and let him run down the way you let a bad storm run down. You don't argue with weather. I fixed the shoe. I charged him fairly. He paid without looking at me and left without thanking me. I came in for supper and Bridget had the soup on and she looked at my face and didn't say anything for a while. We ate. Then she said, "Someone gave you grief today." I said it wasn't worth repeating. She said, "I'm not asking you to repeat it. I'm just saying I can see it." I looked at her. She was looking back at me with that particular look she had, not soft exactly, not the way people mean when they say soft, more like level. Like she'd decided to look at the thing straight. I said, "Harold Patterson's a damn fool, and I should stop taking his horses." She said, "Well then stop taking his horses." I stared at her. Nobody had ever said that to me, the obvious thing, the thing I'd been circling for 2 years because I didn't want to lose the business. Just said it plain like that. She said, "You're the best smith for 40 miles. He knows it. If you tell him you won't take his work anymore, he'll come back in a month apologizing." I thought about that. I said, "You've lived here 3 months." She said, "I've watched people my whole life. I know the type." She picked up her spoon and went back to her soup, and I sat there feeling something I didn't have a word for right away. It took me a few days to find the word, and the word was believed. She believed in the thing I did. Not just that I was competent, I knew I was competent, but that I had the right to be treated well for it. That the competence meant something. That I was allowed to say no to a man who'd been making my Tuesday afternoons miserable for 2 years. I sent Harold Patterson a letter the following week, telling him to find another smith. He came back in November, hat in hand, and apologized. The winter was hard. They always are out here, but this one had a particular meanness to it. Snow in October, which is early, and a cold that got into the stone of the forge and made everything slower, stiffer, louder in a specific way. I had a stretch in December where everything seemed to go wrong at once. A tool I'd had for 20 years cracked, and I couldn't get a replacement until March. 2 horses I was shoeing in the same week turned difficult, and I pulled a muscle in my back that made it hard to sleep. The shop was slow because the ranchers were hunkered in and not doing much that needed iron, and the money I made in the good months didn't go as far as it had when it was only me to feed. I don't want to exaggerate, we weren't desperate. But there were nights when I sat at the table after supper and the quiet got heavy in a particular way, and I'd look at the wood stove and think about Nora, about Cal, about the shape of the life I thought I'd have that had turned into the life I actually had, which was smaller and quieter and more lonesome than I'd bargained for when I was young enough to think I got a bargain. Bridget saw it. She didn't say anything about it right away, which was like her. She let things sit until she knew what she thought. But one evening in December, one of the bad, quiet evenings, I was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she came and sat down across from me. She didn't say, "Are you all right?" She didn't say, "What's wrong?" She said, "Tell me about her." I looked up. She said, "Your wife, tell me about her. I've been here 5 months, and I know her from a space at the table and a curtain and the way you sometimes look at the corner of the room where she isn't. That's all I have of her. I'd like more." I sat with that for a minute. Then I told her. I told her about Nora, not the dying, not the fever, but her. How she'd laughed at things that weren't that funny because she said laughter was a habit like any other and you had to practice it. How she'd argued with the Methodist reverend about scripture in a way that embarrassed me and delighted her. How she used to hum while she worked, the same 3 songs, always the same 3, and I couldn't name any of them, but I'd hear them in my head sometimes still. How she made her tea so strong it was practically black, and said anyone who drank weak tea couldn't be trusted with serious things. Bridget listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to fill the quiet. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She sounds like someone worth missing." I said she was. Bridget said, "Then miss her. You don't have to stop on my account." I looked at her. She looked back at me level, not asking for anything. I said, "Does that not?" I stopped, tried again. "This is an unusual thing to say to a man." She said, "I'm an unusual situation. I came here knowing what I was coming to. I'm not asking you to forget her. I wouldn't want to be with a man who could forget her. That would tell me something about him." I sat with that for a long time. The stove ticked. Wind pushed at the north side of the house. I said, "I'm grateful you're here, Bridget." She said, "I'm glad to be here. That's different from grateful. Do you understand what I mean?" I thought I did. Grateful is what you feel about a gift. Glad is what you feel when you're somewhere you chose. I didn't say any of that. I just nodded. She got up and took my cold coffee and poured it out and poured me a hot one without asking and set it in front of me. Her hand rested on my shoulder for a moment. Just a moment. The weight of it was specific, not heavy, but deliberate, like she'd placed it there on purpose. Then she went back to her letters. I sat with the coffee and I thought, something is happening here that I don't have a name for yet, but something is happening. The thing that broke me open, I don't like that phrase, but I don't have a better one, was in January. Bad cold came on a Sunday night, and by Monday I couldn't get out of bed. This wasn't something that happened to me. I'd been sick exactly twice in my adult life that I could remember, and both times I'd worked through it because there was nothing to do but work through it. This was different. This came up from somewhere deeper. My chest, my lungs. Every breath had something wrong in it, something thick and wrong, and by Monday night I was running a fever bad enough that I stopped being sure what time it was. I was aware of Bridget. Not always. There were stretches where I was somewhere else entirely, but in between I was aware of her. The sound of her moving in the room, a wet cloth on my face that was cooler than the air. She'd pulled the other chair close to the bed, and I don't know how many hours she sat in it, but every time I surfaced she was either there or close. At some point I said, "You should sleep." She said, "I will." I said, "I'm serious." She said, "So am I. Go back to sleep." I wasn't going to argue. I didn't have the air for it. There was a night, I couldn't tell you which night. The days had gone liquid on me by then, where I was in some half-awake place between sleeping and not. And I could hear wind outside, real wind, the kind that comes down off the plains and means business, and I was aware that the lamp was very low and that Bridget was there, and I said something. I don't know what I said. Something about Cal, or maybe Nora, or maybe just something that didn't make sense. The fever will do that to you. What I remember is her voice. She said, "I've got you, stay here." Not, "You'll be fine," not, "Don't worry, I've got you, stay here." Like I might drift off somewhere, and she intended to hold me in place by the sound of her voice alone. I stayed. The fever broke on a Wednesday. I know this because I woke up and it was light and I was very cold and very hungry and everything was quiet. And Bridget was asleep in the chair with her head tipped back and her mouth just slightly open, and I lay there and looked at her for a while. Her face, without the usual arrangement of it, was younger looking. Her hands were in her lap, loose. She had a blanket pulled up to her chin that she must have gotten at some point in the night. She'd pushed herself so far back into the chair that she was almost sideways, like she'd been fighting sleep and lost in the middle of fighting it. She'd been there the whole time. I lay there and looked at her and felt something settle in my chest that was not nothing. I don't know what it was something. It had a weight to it. It felt like, and I know this is going to sound like a strange way to put it felt like the thing that happens when you've been carrying something a long way and you finally set it down. Not relief, more than relief. Like the ground was solid after a long time when you weren't sure it was. I said her name, quiet. She came awake fast, she slept light. I'd noticed that about her, and looked at me and looked at my face, and then something in her own face changed. She leaned forward and put her hand on my forehead, and I could feel that I wasn't burning the way I had been. She said, "Good, just that, the way you say something when you've been waiting for it." I said, "How long was that?" She said, 4 days. I said, "You sat in that chair for 4 days." She said, "Not the whole time. I went out to the shop twice to tell the men waiting that you weren't available." I stared at her. "You went to the shop?" She said, "Someone had to. You had 3 horses waiting." She paused. "I told them you'd be back in a week. I hope that's right." I said, "Bridget." She said, "What?" I didn't know what I was going to say when I started, and then the word that came out was, "Why?" She looked at me a moment, not like she didn't understand the question. She understood it. She was deciding how to answer it. She said, "When I stepped off that train in July, I didn't have shoes. You waited 9 hours, and then you picked up my bag, and you asked if I'd eaten, and you didn't say one word about the shoes." She paused. I'd been a long time around men who would have said something about the shoes. She stood up from the chair and straightened her back, which must have been aching from the position she'd been in. She said, "I'm going to make you something to eat." She started for the door. I said, "I didn't wait 9 hours because I was being kind." She stopped, turned, and looked at me. I said, "I waited because where was I going to go? I waited because I didn't want to go home to an empty house one more time." She was quiet. Then she said, "I know." I said, "That's not a very heroic reason." She said, "I didn't say I was looking for heroic." She looked at me with those level eyes. I said I was looking for a man who asked if I'd eaten. She went to make the soup. March came and the ground started thawing, and I got back to the shop, and the world resumed the shape of work and necessity that I knew how to live in. But something was different. Something had shifted in the house, in the way she and I moved around each other, in the particular quality of the evenings. I found I wanted to come home. This sounds simple, and it isn't. For 4 years, I'd had the shop to go to, and the shop was enough. The work had a logic to it, a satisfaction, the specific pleasure of something done well with your hands. But the house had just been where I slept, where I ate, where I woke up at 4 in the morning sometimes and lay in the dark. Now I found myself thinking about it during the day. The particular light through the south window in the late afternoon. The sound of her moving around in the kitchen. The smell of something on the stove. I didn't know what to do with any of this. I was 58 years old. I'd thought I was done being surprised by what I wanted. The thing that happened in April was small, and I've turned it over more times than I'll admit. We were outside on a Sunday, the kind of April day that almost makes up for February, and I was working on a section of fence that had given up over the winter, and she was in the kitchen garden starting to plan where things would go when planting time came. I could see her from where I was working. She'd found a stick and was drawing lines in the dirt, talking to herself the way she did when she was thinking something through. I broke a nail off the fence post wrong, and the hammer glanced and caught the side of my thumb, and I said something I probably shouldn't have said. She looked up from across the yard. She said, "Are you all right?" I said yes, shaking out the hand. She went back to her stick and her dirt, and I went back to the fence, and maybe 15 minutes passed, and she called over. "What would you think about beans on the east side this year? The light's better there." I said, "Whatever you think." She said, "I'm asking what you think." I looked up. She was watching me with the stick in her hand and an expression that was almost impatient. I said, "I've never grown beans." She said, "You live here. You get a vote." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "East side's fine, whatever gets more sun." She nodded like that was settled, and went back to drawing her lines. I went back to the fence. I stood there with the hammer in my hand and I thought, she said you live here. Not it's your house, not I live here, you live here. Like it was something we'd done together, made a place where we both lived. I drove the nail in clean, wiped my face with my sleeve, stood back and looked at the fence and it was holding. I want to say something about what she gave me, and I want to say it right, which means I'm going to take a minute to find the words. I've known a lot of men who were lonely in the way I was lonely. Not lonely for company exactly, you can get company at a saloon or a stock sale. But lonely in the specific way that means nobody is keeping track of whether you come home. Nobody has any particular investment in whether you live or die. You matter to the people whose horses need shoeing, which is a professional relationship and not the same thing. The world has plenty of use for you and no interest in you, and there's a kind of slow cold that gets into a man who lives that way for long enough. You don't notice it going in. You notice it when something starts to thaw. Bridget came back. That's the simple version. She came off that train with no shoes and no bag, and she sat in a chair beside my bed for 4 days, and she went to my shop and told the men who were waiting that I wasn't available. And when I asked her why she told me, it was because I'd asked if she'd eaten. She wasn't naive. She knew what she was saying, and she said it anyway. She gave me back something I thought I'd used up. Not Nora, nobody gives you that back, and you wouldn't want them to, that's not how it works. But the thing under it. The thing that makes a man want to keep being a man. The sense that his work means something because somebody who doesn't have to care about it has decided to care about it. That his showing up matters to someone. I mattered to Bridget, specifically and in particular. She'd chosen it, freely, knowing what she was choosing with her eyes open. That's a thing, that is not nothing. It's June now, a year and some months since she stepped off that train. The kitchen garden is in. The beans she put on the east side are coming up, and she was right about the light. They look better than anything I could have grown over here on the west side, not that I've ever grown anything on purpose. I sit out on the porch sometimes in the evenings. She comes out too, most times with her letters, or sometimes just to sit. The light goes down behind the low hills to the west, and the air smells like grass and iron and whatever's on the stove, which tonight is something with onions. We don't talk much at those times. We don't need to. I've been thinking about telling her. What I feel, what I actually feel, not the arrangement, not the gratitude for the arrangement, but the thing that started that night in December when she put her hand on my shoulder, and then grew and grew through the winter and the fever and the spring until now it's the thing I feel most of the time and the thing I hide worst. I've been thinking about saying it plain. I haven't yet, I'm working up to it. I'm a man who works up to things. But this evening she came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down and handed me one without asking, the same way she's been doing for months, and she settled into the chair and pulled her shawl around her shoulders and looked out at the light going down, and she said, "Good evening for it." I said, "For what?" She said, "Just sitting." I said yes, said I thought it was. The coffee was hot and the light was the color it gets in June, and she was sitting there beside me in a chair on the porch of the house that is ours, and the beans were coming up on the east side, and the shop was quiet and the fence was holding, and I thought, here. Here is where I am. Here is enough.